Welcome to the Jeff and Alex podcast. I am Jeff Hillemeyer, and with my friend Alex Gonzalez, we explore topics that help you be your best self. And we also get to chat with some great guests. So join us now on the Jeff and Alex podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Jeff and Alex podcast. Hello, Jeff Hillemeyer. How are you?
How's it going, Alex Gonzalez?
Doing good. So what is new with you?
Actually, I was thinking about you this weekend. I watched...
As you should every weekend, by the way.
Right. Well, we record a lot of weekends, so it's
That's true, exactly.
normal. I was watching the Ted Lasso on Apple TV.
Yes.
It's and I don't know how many episodes there are. I just watched the first one, but essentially he's I won't give away too much, but he's an American football coach, right? Like Division II football. And then hired to run one of the more prestigious soccer teams in Europe. And anyways, you're such a soccer fan, but have you watched it?
Yeah. Do you know how Ted Lasso, what the origin of that is?
Is this based on something true?
It's based on a commercial. So it's about maybe call it 4 years, maybe more ago, NBC bought the rights for the English Premier League, which is of course considered the top professional soccer league in the world because of the competition there in England. And as part of the promotion, and this is really when I think there's even pre-Atlanta United and all that. So this is really the momentum of it was a big deal for NBC to have this pretty big package, the rights for the U.S. for that. They got, I believe it was Jason Sudeikis, always mispronounce his name, was a former Saturday Night Live guy, I believe. He's in some movies, to play the role of Ted Lasso. And the idea was you had this, just like the show, you had this football coach go over to England, and I think at the time it was Tottenham, which is, of course, where our friend Darren Eales of Atlanta United came from, to coach them. And, of course, in the commercial, he gets fired. Actually, the commercials were funny because he did not understand soccer, so he did not understand the concept of a tie or a draw, or that, there weren't field goals and the soccer firm was tackled. But that's how that character. So I was amazed to see this. And I've actually watched a few episodes, and they've shaped the character a little bit differently. But yeah, it's actually I'm enjoying it. Of course, that's on Apple Plus.
So the same actor that did the commercial is the star of the show.
Same actor, and I'm pretty sure his co-star, which is the assistant coach, is also in the commercials too.
Crazy.
Yeah. So it was super popular, and if you get a chance, definitely go back. I'm sure it's on YouTube to watch. Mm-hmm. They did 2 extended commercials, kind of little 4 or 5 minute movies maybe. There's an original one and then a second one where he basically gets fired. And I think he ends up coaching like a girls' soccer team in the U.S. or something. So it's pretty good. But yeah, no, I very much enjoy that show as well too.
Nice.
So what else have you been up to, Jeff? I'm excited because I have on my list here to listen to your, of course, award-winning podcast, Begin to Begin. And you've got a pretty cool guest with Ann Kramer.
Yeah, I was thrilled that Ann said she would be a guest. Anyone that has any exposure to Ann knows that she's just this burst of positivity. Somebody commented on the podcast that she's the unofficial mayor of doing good in the city, which I think is just
so true.
This classic. She's also known as the human exclamation point. Which I think is you'll see if you watch the episode. But yeah, no, getting a chance to talk to her and learn about her journey, which is really fascinating, how she got to be the person that she is. It was a really good conversation. I was thrilled she agreed.
Yeah, well, very good.
And speaking of which, I was catching up on Disruptor Studio podcasts, and you've had some amazing guests. The Jay Bailey one is certainly one of my favorites, but then you just had the new one with Tristan a week ago.
Yeah, as we recorded this, the most recent one, we have some pretty cool ones coming up as well too. But Tristan Walker, which is a name that it's interesting. People either know it really well because he's been on the cover of Fest Company, I think multiple times. Founder and CEO Walker Brands, which was was born in Silicon Valley and now they got acquired by Procter and Gamble in 2018. He is the first, I guess, what he said is the first Black president within the Procter and Gamble system. But I'll tell you, he's just an incredible leader, incredible perspectives, passionate about so many things. And so we talked about everything from leadership to design to creativity to his passion about Black economic empowerment. So I definitely would, if you do not know Tristan, I would suggest people listen to get to know Tristan, because he's just an amazing individual. We're very lucky to have him here in Atlanta.
Super inspiring.
And someone else we're lucky to have in Atlanta is Doug Shipman, who many people know until today, as we record this. It's actually his first day not in this role of CEO of Woodruff Arts Center, which is just an amazing place. How do you know Doug, Jeff?
Oh, great question. I met Doug early days of the Center for Civil and Human Rights, and I think I was talking to him about helping with the website, or, anything that I could do to help, because it was just such an inspiring thing. But I remember having meetings with him, and he just had this little office that was like across the street from where the center is now. Early days of him planning it, and just ever since then have kept in touch. We share a passion for many things, but Bobby Kennedy, which not many people do. So we've bonded over that. How about you? How did you first meet Doug?
I met him initially through my work with the Metro Atlanta Chamber around innovation and entrepreneurship. And he is actually, in addition to his passion just around the arts and of course, civil rights and so forth, but in terms of the arts and creativity, as you know, worked a lot in terms of colliding our tech and innovation economy with the arts, which I think was cool. So that's why I got to know him. But then through our interaction on social media, we found out we're both super fans of Atlanta United.
Yeah,
so
you and about 5 million other people.
Exactly. So we've gotten to get pretty close about that. So I'm looking forward to talking to Doug. In fact, so let's actually bring Doug to join us and have a conversation with him.
Let's do it.
Doug Shipman, welcome to the Jeff and Alex podcast. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks, guys. It's good to see you. I haven't seen you in person in a while, so I'm glad to see your faces.
It's been too long. And by the way, before we, I have some show notes here that were different from the show notes Jeff sent me over, because I was going to start out with my first question being, do you prefer a 3-5-2 or 4-3-3 for Atlanta United? But since Jeff doesn't want this to be an hour Atlanta United review show, and we know that Conti and Longshore do a good job at that, I'm going to let Jeff start with the first question, or else, but we'll be coming back to it. Don't worry.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
I'll be ready.
We will definitely be coming back to it. Yeah, Doug, I just thought it'd be interesting if, I actually don't know if I know your story up until at least, when you started getting involved in some of the bigger Atlanta initiatives. So can you give us the quick high level of like up to Woodruff on your career? Sure. And just actually where you grew up?
Yeah. So I grew up in a town called Bull Shoals, Arkansas, a town of about 1,200 people in the middle of northern Arkansas. You could drive 125 miles in any direction and not run into a town of more than 10,000. So, very rural. Ended up coming to Atlanta on a scholarship at Emory named for Robert Woodruff. So that legacy brought me to Atlanta. I got very interested in Atlanta history, civil rights history, and began to study that. That's where that interest began to really bubble up. Then I went into the banking sector for a few years. I went to grad school at Harvard and did joint degrees in public policy and theology. And my theology was a lot around religion and social movements. So people like King, Malcolm X, Gandhi, who have a religious aspect to their social practice. And then my wife wanted to go to med school. She brought us back to Atlanta. She went to Emory Med. I worked for Boston Consulting Group, management consulting firm, for several years. We spent a year in India, which was an interesting time, to say the least, to be able to work and live there. And then I got pulled into a 10-week pro bono project for what was at that time called a civil rights museum by then Mayor Shirley Franklin, that turned into 10 years of me being the founding CEO of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. And I got to bring all that history I had studied, all that academic work, to try to found an institution. And I'd always promised that when it opened, I would leave And so it opened in 2014, and I was the head of it for a year of operations, and I left in 2015. Went to Bright House Consulting when BCG bought Bright House, which is Joey Ryman's firm that he founded. Many people know Joey. And I was CEO there for a couple of years as we integrated the firm and grew it. And then I joined the Woodruff Arts Center and was president and CEO there for 3 years until yesterday. And so today is my first day of not having a formal position.
So how was the coffee this morning then?
It was good. It was good. I think transitions are both exhilarating and a little sad. I think this transitioning in the time of COVID is also a little tough because you don't get to hug people and you don't get to have, sort of that
Right.
final sort of goodbye. So that's a little bit in stasis. But I feel good about where I'm headed, and I'm also excited for doing work. I've said publicly that I want to really come back to every day working on issues of social justice. So I'm excited to get knee deep into that work.
And you're not ready to announce that on this show, are you?
I am. It is a little bit early to announce it on this show.
It's just the three of us. Don't worry.
Yeah.
Exactly. Nobody else will hear. No, I also think that I've only had one break in my career. Every other thing has been absolutely back to back. And so I am going to take this time to make sure that I take a little time in between.
Well, one thing, Doug, just to kind of, I know you spent a lot of time with what you've done here in Atlanta, but one thing I did not know about you, you spent time, you said a year in India?
Yeah.
What part of India were you in?
Yeah, so we lived in Mumbai, in downtown Bombay. I worked for the BCG office in Mumbai, which was fascinating. This was 04, 05, so this is really the boom time of India. And also my wife's parents are from India. She grew up in Atlanta, but her parents immigrated from India in the 60s. So it also was great because we got to spend time with distant cousins and uncles and visit all parts of the country. And India is a third the size of the U.S. with 3 times the population. So it is a fabulous, fascinating place.
Yeah, because I just did. I've not lived there, but had many visits there during part of my GE career, and to me, it was just my first visit was I would consider life changing in terms of what you see in the extremes, and frankly, we talk about some of the issues we're facing in the U.S. as well too, in terms of wealth disparity, and you see it so obvious, and yet the beauty of the country. There's so much there. So yeah, I just very interested in your time there. I'm sure it was very.
Yeah, it was, a couple of things that really stuck with me. One is, when, from a business perspective, when labor is only less than about a quarter of your total cost structure, it changes the way you think about business, right? So whereas we throw technology at everything, they throw labor at everything. And so it was sort of interesting to undo business principles that you sort of get ingrained in you when you work in the US or another sort of developed place. So that was on one side. The other was, I would walk around Bombay and, a couple of weeks at a time and never see another white Caucasian person. And so it gave me just a little bit of a taste to be the other, to be the person who stood out. People would come and they'd ask me where I was from every day. They'd ask me, what my background was. And so that also was, deeply moving, but also it made me do a lot of introspective work about what that feels like, what it is to carry around being a minority and a visible minority every day.
Is that what I am very curious how social justice became so core to who you are? I understand you came to Emory and you said sort of you started to get the feel for Atlanta and so forth, but like did you grow up, was that a part of conversations in the household? Like how did that start to really manifest itself?
Yeah, these things are sometimes easier retrospectively to figure out. And I think for me, when I was very, very young, my brother was 13 years older than me. He went to college. He befriended a guy on his hall who was an African-American cheerleader at the University of Arkansas, football cheerleader. I was a big football fan even as a little kid. So when I went to visit him, I just kind of fell for Arthur. I just thought he was my hero. He got me on the football field. He was this incredible guy. Well, my brother invited Arthur to visit our home. And the reaction when he came to my little town and we took him to the local high school basketball game, people said things, hurled racial slurs. My parents were uncomfortable. They thought something would happen. They wouldn't let him go to the grocery store by himself. And I think it triggered something that, frankly, I've probably been chasing my whole life, but I couldn't square that these people who I loved, my parents, my community, would not love this other guy who I loved. And I thought, he's amazing. What is happening here? My 5-year-old mind couldn't figure that out. But I think it really seeded something about, why is it that there is no reason for this vitriol towards him, yet it is very, very uncomfortable for all of these folks to have him here. And I think that started it all.
So there obviously was not a randomness at BCG when you were given the opportunity to work on this project for the Center for Human and Civil Rights. Is that something that was brewing and you pursued it, or how did that all come about? Because it's just a perfect match in terms of it coming to you.
Yeah. See, I had come to the firm, obviously I had come from a different background, didn't have an MBA, I'd done this theology thing. So everybody, sort of knew me as that, that guy who did that other thing, a little bit. But I also had been very open about my interests with partners at the firm, with others. I would talk politics with anybody. I would talk about racial issues. And so it was kind of known that was an interest of mine. So the truth is, the mayor had used the firm for a lot of different pro bonos. The mayor called and said, I need somebody to help with this. Didn't know me at all. We had met on the campaign trail, but she didn't know me at all. And one of the partners said, we know the perfect guy who would love to do this. And he basically brought it to me. And I share that story a lot with younger people, that sometimes folks say, don't bring your passions to the office, especially if they're, somewhat political or controversial. But the truth is, I never would have gotten that pro bono project had everyone else not known that this was an interest of mine and that it was a passion of mine. So no, I didn't pursue it at all. It came, it was 10 weeks, and then it just continued to snowball into, 10 years of work.
I'm curious. You started off by saying that I guess it was originally called the Civil Rights Museum, and now it's the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, which, I don't know, 10% of people can get right.
Yeah, right. It's very long.
A sort of
and I was all in that 90%.
Right. Is that just a silly question? But as you look back, was the name change? Would you go back and change it to something simpler, or are you happy with where it's at?
So we actually had a very well-known branding firm come in and do some work around this. And we tried to think of all kinds of, do we call it the bridge? Do we call it the,
Right.
the something like that, some catchy thing? And the truth was, when it was being built, the concern was, one, that we wouldn't get the civil rights history right, that we would somehow paper over it, or that we would somehow, the term that was often used was we would whitewash it. And so we wanted to make sure, we didn't want to call it a human rights center because we didn't want folks to incorrectly think we weren't dealing with a real civil rights legacy. By the same token, we wanted them to know we weren't just dealing with the civil rights legacy. And so we tried to come up with a better name, but all in, we needed both civil and human rights because in people's minds, they're distinct, even though I think for a lot of us, they very much flow together. But we wanted them to be there. A lot of people call it the center, and that's
Right.
fine. But actually, the truth is, it is hard to remember, but now I'm pretty excited that it is named that, because I think a lot of people tap into it for their own purposes, which was always the point. I mean, I don't know if you saw, but this week there was a march to remember everyone who's perished in Georgia from COVID. And they came to the Center for Civil and Human Rights and put one heart on the fence for everybody who's perished. And the fact that of all the places they could go outside of Grady, they could go to, some other place, that they decide to come there, I think does show that it feels more than just a historical place. And I think the name reflects that.
And in terms of it being even if I recall the timing, and that whole area as far as the Centennial Olympic Park, I mean, everything was really converging. I mean, so the timing had to be perfect, and it had to be just a great destination within Atlanta. I mean, as you describe it, this is more than just a museum, right? I mean, there's incredible artifacts within the museum as well too. But how do you view it even beyond a museum?
Yeah, so I think when it was founded, and from my perspective, we wanted it to be one that was continually hosting ongoing dialogue and conversation, very tough conversations in a civil way. So how do we really deal with real issues, but how do we not scream at each other? I think as it has evolved, and Jill Sabat, who's now the CEO, and she actually was the human rights curator, so she's been involved with the project since the very beginning. She talks about it in that way. Plus, it needs to be a place in which new activists and new movements are born or sustained. And so sort of a bit agnostic to the exact topic, but she is now pushing, and I think it makes a lot of sense, for training or for convening around how do we move an agenda forward, and what's the next movement for human rights. And so now I think it's actually a place that, in the future, you'll see people saying, when we first started this movement for X rights or for X justice, we met at the Center for Civil and Human Rights and we used it as a launching pad. So I think it's around that. I also think, though, I'm biased because I love history, but I think that we do ourselves a disservice in any field if we don't know the historical context of which we're trying to build upon. And there are lots of lessons and there are lots of insights, I think, that you can get by really knowing history. So I think that there really is some power in the historical aspect as well, but history as applied to today.
The part of that museum that impacted me the most is the lunch counter experience. And what struck me the most, it's so powerful. You sit, you put on headphones and you close your eyes and you imagine that you are, a silent, nonviolent, protester essentially, but you're sitting down and you hear around you all the hate that's coming at you. What struck me was for that, it's 3 minutes. How long is it?
It's about 1:45.
Yeah, it's so short. And yet I had tears when I got done with it. And then I thought to myself, that was 1:45 and it was fake. And I felt it. And I couldn't even imagine being in that situation. And I'm reading John Meacham's new book on John Lewis, and reading about how, John Lewis and everybody who's doing exactly what, you guys set up, they're literally training how to lie on the ground in such a way in a ball that doesn't let their internal organs get hurt while they get kicked and hit. And the aspect that's being enforced to them is, it's not that you are trying to resist the urge to fight back. It's not that you are trying to resist the urge to hate. It's that you need to love that person. That is what they're being trained. Love these people who hate you for who you are and who are beating you, and love the policemen that then come arrest you for disrupting the peace, for sitting there. And it's just like, it's so hard certainly for me to appreciate that experience. But I just really love how you guys were able to build something that, at least for just a moment, was able to put someone who will never experience that into that headspace. Was that a very deliberate, can you talk about that experience for a second?
Yeah, I think it really is a testament to the power of design. So the creative mind behind the center is a guy named George C. Wolfe. And George is a very well-renowned Broadway director, film director, writer. He's won 2 Tony Awards. And he conceived, actually, at the very beginning, he conceived the entire civil rights path. And he had a lunch counter experience right there where it is in the center on this, hand-drawn sketch. And so we had gone back and forth about what it should be. And at one point we were in a meeting and it was going to be video and you were going to see it. And somebody said, well, what if we didn't have video and it was just audio? And George said, that's it, because now people will project themselves into it. It won't be informational. What will happen? You'll put those earphones on, you'll close your eyes, and all of a sudden you will try to be in that moment. And so I think that that was really the incredible insight, right? And the other was George said, you have to make it short enough that it's tension throughout. You can't have somebody intellectualizing it, but you need it to be long enough that it feels, you sort of get the experience. And I think it's just a remarkable thing. And it takes somebody who's been in the theater to be able to conceive how to do that and exactly how to make it work. I'll give you one other interesting insight. George called me one day and he said, Doug, are we going to use the N-word in that exhibition? And I said, well, George, of course it would have been thrown at someone who is African-American if they were the protester, or even would have been thrown at a white person. But what do you think? And he said, I don't think we should, because the moment we use it, people will come out of the experience and they'll start judging whether or not we should have done that. He said, I think we can create just the same amount of tension without the word. So it's not in there. And most people think it is in there because again, they're projecting their own experience into it. So it's very interesting about how you sort of design a way in which an audience is giving their own emotions into this very fake experience. The lunch counter is not even real. I mean, we built it. It's not even a historical artifact, right? It's just a thing made to look that way. The other story I'll tell you, though, to your point, Charles Black and Lonnie King, who are both freedom riders and sit-in protesters, came to visit the center before we opened. They had been involved in helping us conceive it. And they did the lunch counter experience, and I'll never forget, it was just three of us in there, and they took the headphones off, they turned around, I said, what'd you think? And Lonnie said, pretty tame. He said, I sat for 5 hours and had acid thrown on me. I mean, the unbelievable lengths that the protesters went to, it was just incredible. But the notion of radical love, which is what King called what you're talking about, is real. I mean, when I met C.T. Vivian, when we were doing the center, C.T. looked at me and said, we weren't just liberating people who look like me. We were liberating people who look like you. All the people were caught up in this trap of racism and of Jim Crow segregation. He said, I was working to try to help the police officer and the sheriffs and the people yelling at me too. And I think it's exactly what you're talking about. They had this notion of radical love. They wanted to get everybody out of that horrible, horrible system.
Amazing.
So one thing you mentioned, you talk about the power of design in this, and creating experiences and immersive. Is that something that you had kind of going into this? I guess at the time it was a project. Obviously, it's much more than that now. Did you always have that, or did you kind of learn that to see the power of delivering experiences while you were there?
So I'm not a designer by training and don't have a facility for it, but it was very intentional because very early on, our conception was that we were trying to build the whole place for people who had not themselves lived through the movement. The whole big move here was to say, because we knew we were about 50 years since a lot of these events happened. Yeah. So we weren't dealing, we still had folks alive, but we were really dealing with those folks' grandkids who had no, all of this was black and white in their mind, the footage, right? It's not even in color. All that footage for the most part is in black and white. It feels very ancient. So the whole point of the center was to try to give them their own experience where they could say, oh, I can now imagine what it felt like to be at the March on Washington, to be at a lunch counter, to be at King's funeral. I now have my own connection to those events. And so that was always the intent. And so we knew we're going to have to design it in some way that appealed. I mean, one other kind of interesting story, the last thing we did before it opened was we went through and adjusted the lighting so that it worked well for cell phone, iPhone photos, because we knew that people would experience it also via their own technology. They'd want a selfie, they'd want, a picture of, the lunch counter or whatever it was. And so we relit the lighting levels for that. So there was a real intentionality for it to be designed in a way that created those experiences above it being authentic to like the lunch counter. It didn't have to be real. It needed to work in that way.
Doug, I sort of want to know from your perspective, we've talked about this before. You at the center of building an experience like this, yet obviously being a white man. I know that you took that seriously and probably contemplated on that. Should I be taking on this project or even taking it for 10 years? Can you talk about that? Just sort of like, it's such a core passion for you, but at the same time, you know, you don't experience many of these things. How do you reconcile that?
Yeah. So I think, you have to remember that this idea had come from Evelyn Lowry and Andy Young and Hosea Williams, who had talked about something like this for 25 years. So it had organically come out of the movement saying, we need something like this. Shirley Franklin, first female mayor of Atlanta, African-American woman, who wasn't in the movement herself, but she was close to that generation. She was the driver, the public driver of this. A.J. Robinson was deeply, deeply involved, Jewish man. So, we had a coalition of different identities, right, that was working on this. But to me, the interesting insight, when I first started full-time, I had 125 individual or small group meetings, mostly with people who had lived through the movement. And they would sort of test me whether or not I really knew civil rights history, which I knew a lot about. But then I basically would ask them, what are you most afraid of when it comes to this project or even this history? And they would give me some version of the answer. I fear that my grandkids won't care about it when I'm gone. And I said, let me be the bridge between you and your grandkids, right? Let me help tell that story so they care. And let me help tell the story so it's not just your grandkids, but it's mine, and it's Asian American grandkids, and it's Hispanic grandkids. Let's make it for anybody who wants to participate. And that became the core, right? So it was this balance, and we did have a lot of people from the civil rights generation giving us input and help and critiquing the content. But at the end of the day, it was not trying to be the encyclopedia of the civil rights movement. It was trying to be an experience for those who were younger. And I think that, combined with the fact that Atlanta, I don't think that in any other city, someone of my generation and of my color could have been, such a big part of the effort, except for Atlanta, right? In Atlanta, multiracial coalitions have always been the norm. Mayor Ivan Allen's role, of course, is extremely well known in the civil rights movement. I think Atlanta as a community is much more comfortable with that multiracial coalition than other places. And so I think that also allowed me to play, this role.
So Doug, yeah, it's interesting as we sit here, just thinking about the legacy, and the moment that you've left that will outlast all of us on the Zoom. It has to be so powerful. So, so you said it was about 10 years of your life,
Yeah.
On this.
Yeah.
And so you were pretty deliberate early on. You wanted to kind of get to the design and then move on. I mean, how was that in terms of kind of stepping away? Was it just, you're probably exhausted, first of all, because I obviously starting something from that had to be just exhausting in every aspect possible. But but at the same time, with the conversations, the people you met, and it's so close to you and your heart, how was just leaving the project? Or the center at the time? It was a center at that point.
Yeah. So I had made the decision very early on. In fact, when Mayor Franklin asked me to do it full time, I said, I have two conditions, one of which is when it opens, I leave. Because I wanted it to not be caught in founder syndrome. I wanted it to be much bigger, because it is much bigger. This topic is so important to so many people that it can't get caught up in the founders. And Shirley Franklin and I and AJ all really agreed with that notion. So one is, I felt like that it really needed that in order to keep us all honest and to let it, be, really embraced by everybody else. And I'll just note, Arthur Blank is publishing his new book, and he's, this month, and all the proceeds are going to the Center for Civil and Human Rights, right? I mean, a testament to that other people are embracing it. But I'll tell you, so I knew this for 10 years, and it still was highly emotional when I left, knowing that I was going to leave, because it is very hard to let go of the things you didn't get done, right? I can give you a tour of the exhibitions, and I can show you all the things that aren't in there. all the ideas that are on the cutting room floor, all the things I wish would have happened, right? And as a founder, you're constantly fighting to get the project up, but once it's up, you still are kind of fighting for the things that are left behind. And I think it was emotional because I had to let that go. Obviously, you know, it's been embraced. It's a great success. It's what we wanted to happen. So I think it was very emotional to do that. You know, it's now 6 years since it opened, and so now I have, you know, most of that has fallen away, and it feels pretty good. But I'll also say, you know, Shirley Franklin turned to me the day before we opened, and she sort of grabbed me by the shoulders, and she said, "You need to eat up the next couple of days because this doesn't come around very often in a lifetime." And I think that the other thing is, you know, that when you've worked on something big and you founded it, you've played that role, you know that you don't get too many shots like that. And sometimes it's hard to let go because because it's that thing. And so, look, I've gone through all those emotions, but I absolutely believe it was the right decision. And you know, look, and then when good people like Jill Savick come and to lead it, it's just a confirmation that it was the right thing to do.
And I love that you said, you know, Atlanta was the place where you could be a part of that and a part of creating that, right? So let's transition for just a bit here to a topic that I know you two are nuts
Oh, you're
about.
bringing it up. You're bringing
Look
it
at
up.
this. Look,
Oh man.
I'm gonna transition.
Oh
Look,
my
Atlanta
God.
United
I thought you were
swag.
going to arts or something. This
Look,
is
look.
okay. We're done. We're done.
I'm a fan, but I'm not like you guys. I will start with this. Like, you know, I grew up in Atlanta. I went to Stone Mountain High School. I've been here since I was 4 years old. I've never seen anything bring the city together the way that Atlanta United has. The closest I can come is in 91 when the Braves were coming back worst to first, and then 95 when they won the series. And like, you'd literally be driving down the road and people would be tomahawk chopping, and it didn't matter what race you were. It didn't matter who you were. But seeing just how every part of our city has come together around Atlanta United. I'd love to hear your perspective, Doug, on why you think that happened and the importance, if you do see it that way, the importance of this team for this city.
Well, first, I think the corollary with the early 90s Braves is spot on. I was here for that too. It has the same sort of emotional relevance. You know, I think there are a lot of factors, and people have written about it. The fact that we've had a lot of young people move into the city, the fact that a lot of people haven't grown up with a soccer club, so that everybody can embrace it, even if you're a Giants fan or a Knicks fan, it doesn't matter, right? You can embrace this new. But I think the real insight for me is the United, as they came out of the gate, really embraced some core Atlanta elements so that this team didn't feel manufactured. It felt like it was drawing on authentic current elements of Atlanta, specifically the hip hop community, specifically a huge embrace of the Latino community, and the use of Spanish chants, et cetera, and just an embrace of real soccer culture. I mean, Darren Eales told me a story that, you know, they wanted to put cheers on the halo board. And he said, no, in soccer, you don't tell the fans when to cheer. The supporters section, you know, these group of fans tell the other fans when to cheer. And I think this combination of finding unique Atlanta elements combined with the way that soccer works in the rest of the world really created a lot of magic. And I think that it is important because I think that one, you know, there are a lot of new folks who don't do sports that have come together around the United. You know, their season ticket base is unlike almost any other team. I think two, they really have embraced diversity in a way that's just unlike any other fan base that you'll see. I mean, there's an LGBTQ supporters group, there's a hip hop supporters group, there's a family supporters group. I can't tell you how many folks in my wife's sort of, extended Indian American community have tickets, follow the team. I mean, it's just incredibly robust. And so I think that's important. And the other is, I think that it also is extremely youthful, right? I mean, it is a very young kind of fan base And thus they can do things like, they have a voter initiative, right? They have initiatives around social justice. They can embrace the kind of zeitgeist of the moment more broadly in ways that I think a lot of the other sports struggle with. I mean, we've seen what the NFL has gone through around all of the Colin Kaepernick controversies. We've seen what baseball's gone through. The NBA at this moment, I think the NBA and soccer are the two best positioned, and the WNBA, both the NBA and the WNBA and soccer are best positioned to really be active in these ways. And I think that it is a unique new thing that will help define Atlanta for the next generation. No question about it.
So Doug, did you go into your, and Jeff knows, Doug and I are like, both super fans here, and I've been fortunate to see a few games together as well. But did you see yourself as were you a soccer fan first? Did you grow up with soccer, or did this make you a soccer fan, or how did that? Because that's an incredible story for each individual fan for Atlanta United. It's so distinct.
Yeah, so I didn't grow up a soccer fan. I didn't play. Unfortunately, in my my community, we didn't have that. I grew up playing basketball. I grew up a huge basketball fan, and I grew up a huge college football fan. I used to go to Arkansas football games. As I moved, and then I was a huge Braves fan, especially in the '90s, and went to a lot of those games. As I had kids, I knew that I wanted to have a family experience where we went to some sort of games. That was something very nostalgic. My dad and I would do. We would go to games, a whole ritual. I had all the garb. I knew all the players, and I wanted to give my kids that. I have two daughters. And so, my wife and I were trying to figure out what that sport was going to be. And it just clicked at the right moment for us that this was it. And so I had watched World Cups and, nominally followed soccer. But this really became this is what our family can do together. And it happens to be very Atlanta, and it sort of aligns with what I like about Atlanta. And it's a great time. It's just, it feels as close to, the college football experience, every single match, I think, is of anything that I've ever seen professionally. And so that's why it worked for us. We probably wouldn't have as much engagement without the kids as we do.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too when you look at the fan base, people coming from different backgrounds, and I like you did not grow up with soccer, and then I kind of adopted it when my middle son became huge into soccer at the youth level and then more competitive, and then all of a sudden I came across a World Cup and like, what is this sport? And fell in love with it, and then Atlanta United, the timing was perfect. But I think it's beautiful, though. You're talking about the kind of tapestry of Atlanta inside Mercedes-Benz Stadium, or just watching it. And it's interesting. You have some soccer purists who sometimes look and get frustrated that people don't understand the rules. But I think that's the beauty of it. That you have so many people so new to the sport, just embracing the club, embracing the identity. And I think, to me, that is what makes Atlanta United powerful. It's beautiful soccer, and I think we have a club that's very committed to being, obviously, championship level. But it's really even beyond that. It's about identity.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's also, we've talked a lot since the Olympics as a city of being an international city, right?
Right.
But the truth is we've struggled a little bit with the entree points for our international communities to really find their way into Atlanta. Sometimes the civil rights legacy can be that, but this really can be that. I mean, I can't tell you how many folks I've taken to a match and they've said, oh yeah, I grew up in the Netherlands, or I grew up, in such and such following. I mean, I think for folks who have backgrounds from other countries, this is the one spot where they find familiar ground, because soccer is such a huge sport globally, but also can find themselves in the fabric of Atlanta very, very quickly. And I think that's going to be one of its very lasting legacies, is that foundational base, I think, is going to be very, very strong for a long time.
Absolutely. And
I love the story. If I could jump in, the Bobby Dodd standing, the seats and stuff. Do one of you want to tell that story? I'm sure you tell it better than I can.
Yeah, so I mean, the club was going to start their first match. Mercedes-Benz Stadium was running late, so they had, they'd hoped that maybe they could have their first match in the new stadium. They couldn't, so they went to Georgia Tech's Bobby Dodd Stadium, an outdoor stadium, a football stadium, And, you know, nobody knew how many people were really going to show up. Nobody knew what it was going to feel like. And Atlanta, you know, rightly or wrongly, has a little bit of a reputation about being the best fan culture for sports, you know, except maybe around college football.
No, but
And
that's right. But that's right. And you said it earlier, but like growing up here, like, you know, my dad was from New York, and so it was the Giants, right? And so when we went to a Falcons game, it was to see the Giants, and it's such a transplant town. So I think you hit on something really interesting about Atlanta United. No one has a soccer team, and you know, hockey tried here, and everybody had a, you know, like Dad had a hockey team. So I do think that's an important thing, and I do think that's why Atlanta's not been a good sports town, because most of us have been raised by our parents' teams. This is the first time you can, like, I can own that. So anyways, I just wanted to, that was such
That's exactly right.
That's right.
So to that point, nobody knew if anybody was going to show up with, you know, with garb, with, you know, with flags, or what was going to happen. And I distinctly remember walking up to the stadium, and I was with my brother-in-law and his wife and my wife, and I turned and I said, this is crazy. Because there were people everywhere. There were people with drums. People already had all of the gear, and it was full. And so you walked in the stadium, 50-something thousand people, and nobody sat the entire match. Everybody stood the entire match, which they lost, and everybody walked away excited, right? It was just such a different emotional sort of engagement and community. And then when you went back the second match, which I think actually was the most important, because I could have seen the first match kind of being the outlier. But then when you went back the second match, and it was exactly the same. And in fact, the second match was hotter than the first match. I remember it being a really hot day. It was an afternoon match, and still everybody stood up, and still the whole thing was full. And now even more people had the gear because they figured out what it would, you know, what it meant to be a good fan. And then it was off to the races. I mean, it's interesting. Darren and the team have talked about that. They think that really helped the club, not being in Mercedes-Benz and being in that, you know, that Bobby Dodd environment with the bleachers and such. But I think it really set the whole tone for what it meant. I mean, you were expected to be an active participant in this thing. I mean, it's sort of like the lunch counter in a weird way, right? You weren't just receiving it as entertainment. You had a role. I mean, I think that's the difference in the whole club, is that it really feels as if the fans have an active role. I mean, even down to, you know, if you don't follow soccer, there's something called a tifo, which is basically a big banner that's rolled out before the match that's thematic. So it may thank the coach. It may, you know, have something funny about the other team. But it's all done by fans on a volunteer basis. It's really anticipated before every match to see what that tifo looks like. Again, you're an active participant. You're expected to do something, not just to show up and drink your beer. And I think that's cool.
And you know, you mentioned, I think Darren Eales, you know, would said the seats were such a rubbish, you know, over at Bobby Dodd, that it forced people to stand. But he'll acknowledge that it's really created the identity that if it went to Mercedes-Benz Stadium first, people would have been, it's so plush there, people would have just been sitting. And for those who are watching or listening, Darren Eales is the president of Atlanta United, and the first president of Atlanta United was the architect. And we, I think we're so lucky to get Darren one to the club and to Atlanta. And just to give a shameless plug here, we've had him on the Disruptor Studio, and he talks about this Bobby Dodd experience and what it means. But, you know, we've been very fortunate to get to know, all three of us, to get to know Darren. You know, yeah, he was the right person at the right moment at the right time in terms of his ability to embrace the culture of Atlanta and shape the team around that, including the United name, which if you recall, Doug, that at first was like, United, that's so generic, but it really has come to be an identity of what Atlanta's all about.
Yeah, that's right. I think the other interesting thing about Darren, you know, there's a famous story that he went to pubs for about a year and a half and would just go when English soccer was on or when there was a big sort of international match, and he would just drink beers with people and ask them what they wanted out of the club. He was just doing sort of this friend raising and this research for about a year and a half in pubs. But I think what the United uncovered were a lot of untapped markets that were looking for something to be involved with, or they were already into soccer. You just couldn't see them because they were consuming soccer in very small groups. There was a great mini documentary, about a 15-minute documentary that was done online about Atlanta's black soccer culture.
Yep.
And,
Yeah,
you know,
it's really good.
there's a huge number of African-American folks in Atlanta who play soccer, follow soccer, et
Right.
cetera. But again, there was no way to see it. You couldn't really see how big that participation already was, except for youth soccer. But these are adult leagues. These are folks watching Premier League on Saturday mornings. I think it was a really interesting tapping into untapped markets.
Yeah, and I think on the youth level, you know, with soccer in the streets, Atlanta United has been a big supporter of to get more African American athletes into soccer and into the
Yep.
youth academy, which traditionally had not occurred as much, particularly in soccer.
That's
So I think
right.
they're doing an amazing job. And before, because I know Jeff's going to probably pivot us from, you know, because we could go for the next hour. Although we definitely need to talk about arts and creative. But real quick, what is your match day? This is, of course, in the non-COVID world.
Yeah.
What is your match day ritual going to Mercedes-Benz Stadium?
Yeah, so usually we have our kids. We usually go early enough to see the team get off the bus. Before every match, they get off the
Yep.
bus and they come down and sort of give high fives to all of the fans. So we usually try to do that. You can sign what's called the golden spike, which is this
Yep.
ritual beforehand. So we usually sign the spike. Then we go inside and we eat and we, you know, watch a little pregame, and then we hit the match. Another great thing, it's 2 hours and you're done.
Yeah.
It's not that long. We hit the match and we go home. And that's, you know, that's typically what we do. And the kids know the stadium and they know where we like to do things. And, you know, they have their favorite places they want to eat. And so that's pretty much the ritual. And then the other is if it's not with the kids, then typically what I'll do is I'll invite a couple of people with us, and then we'll go early and we'll basically we'll stand behind our seats and have a beer and catch up. And it's really interesting. I've never had anybody turn me down in an invitation to go to an Atlanta United match. It is
That is correct.
it is an interesting convener, I think, in lots of cool ways. So I've been able to catch up with friends I haven't seen in a while by going to a match together.
So 2021 Atlanta United match, you and I, Jeff Hillemeyer, will be right in the middle, you know, hearing the conversations. Maybe he'll, you know, learn about offsides or something.
That's right.
So
Pitch,
That's right.
the pitch.
That's right. The pitch. That's right.
All right. Well, let's talk for a second. We can't talk with you without diving a little bit into the arts.
Yeah.
You obviously had the role at Woodruff. So what was arts like? Clearly there's a call within you around, you know, social justice. Was arts a passion for you, or did it become, how did that happen?
Yeah, I've always been a big patron of the arts. My college roommate was a theater major. I used to go, because I was at Emory, I used to go to the High and to the Alliance and to the Symphony and to Dad's Garage after college and Actors Express. So I've always been a big patron of the arts. The role was interesting to me specifically because of two reasons. One, the Arts Center continues to really open itself up to be more accessible, to be more diverse in its audiences, to be more inclusive of artists and presentations and voices. That work was already happening before I arrived, but I really wanted to accelerate it. I really wanted to find ways to fund it and to make it institutionally, you know, really solid. So that was really interesting. And the other is how, you know, in this time when institutions, big institutions, legacy institutions aren't trusted, right? They're really kind of in a bit of a crisis. How do you take a 50-year-old institution that frankly has been founded as pretty exclusive, pretty white, pretty wealthy, and how do you take that legacy and pivot it without having to destroy it, right? So how do you take this big institution and how do you move it in a way that you know, let's not get rid of all that institutional relevance and let's not get rid of all those relationships, but how do we move it in a way so that folks who haven't felt comfortable being there do feel comfortable? And to me, that was an interesting challenge because I'm a person who really believes that we need those legacy institutions as well as new entities. We need both of them right now. We can't just burn down the things that, you know, that have been created in ways that aren't okay. we can't just get rid of those. We got to find a way to reform those. That's my perspective. Some people agree with that, some people don't. And so to me, it was really interesting to think about the ways in which this very big institution could pivot. And I'm excited for the things that have happened, and the ways in which, the High Museum now on a daily basis, outside of students, the visitation is 50% people of color, 50% white, which is about 5 times better than most every other institution in the country. That it can be done. Now, Atlanta has a little bit easier time because we're so diverse, but it can be done with some work. And people feel good about it. People feel like the High is reflecting them. People feel like the Alliance is reflecting them. And so I think, to me, it was, I'm a patron of the arts, but it was really these challenges around the institution itself that were most interesting to me.
And to kind of ground people on Woodruff Arts Center in general, kind of talk about what that really is, and the fact, and if I'm correct, it's the 4th largest art center in the country.
Yeah, it's third largest art. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was founded in the late 60s. It had come out of this tragedy of a group of over 100 arts patrons were traveling through Europe. Their plane crashed at Orly Airport in Paris in 1962. They died. And the Art Center was a memorial to them that opened in 1968. It's one 501c3, which makes it kind of unique nationally. And under that overall umbrella is the Alliance Theater, which is the largest regional theater in the Southeast, the High Museum, which is the largest art museum in the Southeast, and the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra, which is the largest orchestra in the Southeast, as well as kind of all the other things, hosting and education that the Art Center does. So it's really like our Lincoln Center or Kennedy Center. It is the 3rd largest in the country. And it has this, this incredible legacy of generations have grown up going to it as students, as families, et cetera. And it really, it's a $85 million budget in non-COVID times. It is it hosts 1 million people a year. It's a big place, and it also collaborates. I've always joked that there should be an alumni of Woodruff, because so many other artists have somehow been connected as working there, being highlighted there, their first play was produced there, whatever the case may be, that it really is a generator, I think, in a lot of ways for a lot of the artistic endeavors that happen in Atlanta and beyond.
So I think it's really interesting. You started the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. There's me in the 10%. And then you went to something almost exactly opposite, right? Something that, as you pointed out, mostly white attendees and patrons, stodgy maybe in some situations, old, established, big, respected, but, and then, so that just seemed to me, it must've been a challenge to you. You're like, all right, I've started something from scratch now, helped born that into the city. Now I'm going after this. Was the challenge of that sort of what piqued part of your interest?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think, I'm a big proponent of that a leader has to not only match from a skill set perspective, but also has to match the moment, right? And that every leader doesn't necessarily match every moment. And that there are cycles and there are stages, different kinds of stages. And obviously at the Center for Civil and Human Rights, I was in the startup stage, right? I was in the creation stage, and that has a certain set of skills you need, and also a certain set of emotion that you need, and frankly, just sort of persistence and aggression that you have to have in order to get something across the finish line. Moving an institution is much more of a long-term play. It's a much more subtle play. It's a different kind of leadership. And so, yeah, I think there was both a challenge there, and also very much instinctually and overtly, I came in knowing that there were certain things that I wanted to do. There were also just what I call some plumbing things that needed to be done, just the way the organization worked.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're gonna pivot into what we're doing now, there's certain things internally that folks won't ever see that just needed to be changed and updated and really kind of processes improved. And so I knew that there was a certain kind of leadership and a certain set of expectations that I was going to do. And the truth is, when I came to the Woodruff, it was a 3-year commitment. That's what I fulfilled. I didn't know at the end of 3 years what it would look like. And I think, as things have happened externally, I've just been compelled to dive in. But I think that, again, different leaders, different times call for different skills. And as a leader, when you come into it, I think you have to be real honest with yourself about what does this moment call for and what skills am I going to use? And am I going to try to impose myself on the situation, or am I going to be more reactive to what the situation requires?
Doug, I remember when I believe it was the first time I met you or pretty early on, and I started working on this stuff around innovation and tech, and I always had a belief that, create the creative and the arts is something we should embrace into that. And I remember sitting at the cafe there, and you started going into this vision of we need to bring tech and innovation into the arts and creative. There was this collision that had to occur, which I just thought was beautiful because it was so uniquely Atlanta. So talk about that a little bit in terms of kind of your outreach, particularly at Woodruff, to do that, and why you believe that's so important.
Yeah, so it's interesting. When I arrived at Woodruff a little over 3 years ago, there was only one person who you would call from the tech community on one of the boards. And there are about 350 board members across the whole campus because each of the three has a board and then the overall institution has a board. And so that was really kind of curious to me why that was. So one thing is that we have recruited many board members. We're probably up to 20 or 25 who you'd say, oh yeah, that person's from the tech community onto the boards across Woodruff. So one, that's good because I think they're just bringing questions and ideas and thoughts and collaborations that probably we weren't having brought to the table as readily before. But I think, fundamentally, if I think about the way the economy as a whole is going, really people, change careers a lot. A lot of what we do is in virtual spaces or is in creative spaces, right? I mean, fundamentally, when I talk to the tech sector, they say, we love to recruit former theater kids, graphic designers, people who, were actors, and now they've become programmers, but just the thought process and that flexibility, because ultimately artists are problem solvers, right? They've got a problem. They're trying to create something. That's just a problem and then they've got materials they're trying to use and it's never been done before. And so that kind of fundamental ethos of the process, I think in tech and in the creative arts are very much aligned. And I also think that as we sort of project forward, we see that educationally, folks who have a creative background are much better able to deal with the new economy as it continues to flourish than those that don't. And so to me, there's something that's really there. Now, the hard part is, technology is an applied science. And the arts are somewhat applied and somewhat, aesthetic, right? I mean, they're somewhat for the artists to express themselves. And so I think what we're all continuing to find is to try to bring those two things together. But I don't know if you guys caught the Virgil Abloh exhibit that it was at the High last year. Virgil Abloh is he's this very multi-talented guy. He was a trained architect. Then he started a fashion line called Off-White, which is huge. Now he's the menswear designer for Louis Vuitton. He's also a visual artist. He's also done album covers for hip hop artists. I mean, he's just this multi-talented guy, and he's 39, right? So he's super young, but he's infusing technology in the way that he's creating a lot of his work. And I think we're going to continue to see artists like that. And I think there's going to continue to be this back and forth between the arts and technology. We're seeing AI now help composers compose new classical music. We see the way that set design is going with in the theater to be very technologically oriented. There are going to be shows that frankly are going to have AI characters in them very soon. And so I think there's a lot of way to bring that together. It's just going to continue to be bringing artists and technologists into the same space to co-create. And I think that's going to take a little time because at first they feel like they're on two different paths, but the truth is I think they're very closely related.
Yeah, I love that's where you were taking things, or one aspect of where you were evolving. And I also had conversations in what I guess that octane that was there with you about that. I want to transition just a little bit. It's interesting to me that Woodruff, you said, started in 1968, which is a very important year in this country. we certainly lost Dr. King, but we also lost Bobby Kennedy, which I know you share a passion for Bobby the way that I do. Can you talk just for a minute about why or how Bobby's important or what you draw from him? And then I also want to take that and move into, I feel like Bobby was 42 when he was assassinated. But I feel like he was just getting started. And in an interesting way, I feel like you're just getting started. I feel like you're just starting to, like, clearly you've still got passion and so what you're going to do next. But that was something that I always felt when I connected Bobby. It's like he was just getting started, sort of middle of his and yet he was on this trajectory. So anyways, I know we share that, and I want to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so Bobby's a very interesting figure to me because he comes from this gilded place, right? I mean, his father had been a very prominent ambassador. His brother had been president. He had become attorney general basically because his brother was elected, right? I don't think he would have been elected by Nixon or somebody else, right? So he, he's mid-30s and he's basically inherited an enormous amount of access and power. And it's interesting, Charles Black, who I mentioned earlier, once told me that he and Bobby had a conversation in 66 or 67. And Bobby turned to Charles and said, I have to thank you because the student protesters taught me how to not be a racist. He said, I really didn't understand what was happening in this country to African-American people until I really interacted with you all. And I have to thank you for helping me learn. And I think that embodies that Bobby in 66, 67, 68 is really starting to really deeply understand what we would now call privilege, right? His economic privilege, his racial privilege. He's really starting to grapple with that. And he's also, what I love about Bobby is he's putting himself deeply in situations where he is touching other people. He goes to India, he goes to South Africa, he goes to Appalachia, and he listens, right? He doesn't preach, he listens and he walks and he's really trying to digest what's happening. And then he's trying to come forward with some sort of notion of how to help. To me, that's super inspirational because here's somebody who didn't have to, who's already got all this power and access, yet he's humbling himself to go and say, these folks have something to teach me that I don't know, and I know that I don't know it. And so that's very, very inspirational. And I do think it's an incredible loss for the country that he was murdered so early on. But I think that lesson of how do you put yourself in the position that you can hear other people's stories, and that then you can start to think about how you can uniquely contribute to, bettering the conditions. I think that's what I really take away from Bobby. And the other thing that there's a very famous speech that he gives when Dr. King is killed. He's in Indianapolis campaigning. Yeah. John Lewis is with him. Actually, John Lewis is at the foot of that stage because he had been campaigning with Bobby on that day. And Bobby quotes the Greeks to talk about the pain and the tragedy. I also, I have a soft spot for Bobby because he loves history and he quotes poetry and he's going back to sort of these universal truths that I also think is just super powerful. And so I take a lot from Bobby's life.
When Dr. King died in 68, John Lewis sort of famously said, at least we still have Bobby. And then 2 months later, Bobby was assassinated. It's just what I like about Bobby too is that, you hit on it, but like he changed. He did, even him and Jack were trying to slow the movement down. Dr. King, like they were like, look, we know this needs to happen, but you guys need to slow down. And these freedom rides and stuff, you guys need to stop that. They didn't get it, right? And it took time. It took Bobby listening. And that's, to go full circle to the experience you created at the center. I just think that's the thing, like the ability to listen and to have empathy and to just try to understand what someone else might have gone through. That's what's inspiring to me about Bobby. When I sort of, give talks to, especially to students, one of the things I say is like, I've got every privilege a human being can have. And I usually say, other than I wasn't born a Kennedy, which means, I wasn't born rich, but I am, white, straight, male, whatever. But Bobby was. And so that's, I draw from that. So anyways,
just one other point there, as we are in this moment, and I think a lot of white folks are trying to really feel a burden to do more. A lot of white folks have come to me and said, look, in this moment of social justice, Black Lives Matter, what can I do? I think a lot of times we try to intellectualize that. We want to read a book. We want to study the problem. We want to keep it in our mind. And again, I think Bobby shows us that it needs to be in our feet, and it needs to be in our hands, and we need to find ways to touch it. And I know that's hard in COVID at the moment, but in so many ways, he's actually creating relationships. It's not in a book for him. He's really actually interacting. And I think that's such an important lesson. If people are really serious about knowing more, they need to put themselves in experiences that are real, that then they have to grapple with what it felt like, what it tasted like, what I heard when I looked in that person's eyes. What did they tell me? Not just in a book.
Yeah, I mean, he went and fasted with Cesar Chavez. I mean, he definitely got in there. So again, I could talk to you about an hour on this. It's just the way that Alice could talk to you about Atlanta United. I do want to take that and say, okay, I really do feel like it seems like you are just getting started, and you've had these incredible experiences, and while you may or may not know exactly what's next, and you may or may not be willing to share that, I would love for you to just talk about the directions you want to head and the types of things you want to affect, and share at least directionally what you're thinking.
Well, I think for me over time, the key question that I've always come back to is, how can I uniquely contribute, given my own identity, background, skill set, et cetera? How can I uniquely contribute to something that's going to have a real fundamental impact? And Shirley Franklin once told me that the best advice she ever got as mayor was that the mayor of Denver had told her, you're going to work on a lot of fires, you're going to answer a lot of emails, you're going to respond, but every week you ought to carve out time for something that will matter 50 years from now. Because that will, one, be probably your legacy, but two, thinking on a 50-year timeline will change the way you do everything else, because it will force you to build things and make decisions in a different way. And so to me, I'm thinking about things that are going to matter 50 years from now, which is really kind of my kids and their kids kind of impact. Two, I do come back to that question of, I have had very unique experiences. I've lived in another country. My family by marriage is an immigrant community. I have spent a lot of time with civil rights icons and with foot soldiers, and have learned from them. I have these kind of unique experiences. So how do I bring those to bear? And I think the other is, look, as I read the issues of the conversations around social justice and inequality, I keep coming back to, if we don't fundamentally change some policies, we're not going to fundamentally change outcomes. I don't think that the corporate sector or the philanthropic sector, that those two sectors alone can address really the structural issues that we're struggling with. I'll give you one stat. Before COVID, in the city of Atlanta, the poverty rate was 25%, which means it's probably 30% now, when it comes to COVID. Almost a third of people are in poverty in our city. It's just unacceptable. But without policy and philanthropy and the business sector, I don't think we're going to really move that needle. And so I keep coming back to the policy questions. What are the ways in which we can really affect policy that's not zero sum? So we're going to penalize one group to help an issue, but we do have to really think about the way that regulations work, that budgets work, that money flows, that we're investing enough in small businesses, that we're investing enough in entrepreneurs in neighborhoods that don't have a lot of entrepreneurism. Those kinds of questions, I think, are the ones that are on my mind. So I'm doing a little bit of grad school too. I have to admit, I'm sort of delving back into some of the public policy issues that I haven't been around for a while, just to try to understand what I think are the biggest levers right now to address some of these issues. Because fundamentally, at the end of the day, in my opinion, we're leaving a whole lot of talent out of our society right now, right? There are a whole bunch of smart people that are never getting the chance to really flourish. And so there's a big unlock here. There's a big, imagine if we had, instead of 30% poverty, 5% poverty, 25% of folks were finding their own way to start their own businesses or be a part of the creative economy or be a part of the next nonprofit. I mean, to me, it's an investment that has enormous upside, but I'm thinking about, what are the right kind of interventions? And then also what role can I uniquely play on it? I mean, it's very, as you can tell, it's very centered on Atlanta. I mean, I don't want to go any place. I think there are a lot of unique assets here to pull from. And I'm have deeply connected with this place over a long time. But I'm still trying to figure out exactly what it is.
Well, Doug, for this being day one of the day of figuring out what it is, you got a lot on your plate. So first of all, I want to say thank you so much for not only being on the show, but really everything you've done for Atlanta. I mean, when you kind of go through our discussion here, there's things that it's so cool. There's sort of things that's going to allow all of us you've really been part of or have started. So thanks for that. But I know that we'll be hearing from you a lot. I'm sure we'll have you back on the podcast here at some point. I am sure we're going to figure out a way to have a recurring Atlanta United series as well too.
I love it.
But we'll talk about that offline. But seriously, thank you for being here on the Jeff and Alex podcast.
Oh, thank you guys. I appreciate the chance, and I'm happy to chat anytime.
Thanks, Doug.
Thanks. That was Doug Shipman here on the Jeff and Alex podcast, and wow, what did you think about Jeff? That was a great conversation.
Well, I have to say he's my favorite guest so far.
That's right. We'll tell him he's number one of one right now.
So I get to say that at this point. Oh, I just, I think both of us, we could have kept that going for hours. We'll have to do a part 2, but I was just really impressed with how thoughtful he is about the things that he's done in his life, the impact that he wants to make, his lessons on leadership, just really inspiring.
Yeah. And look, there's some great, you think you know someone, but, obviously Doug is very much in the public eye with his role, but then hearing little things that kind of shaped him, which I think is always amazing, like his time in India, his personal passions. Of course, I got to hear about you and his your collective passion about Bobby Kennedy, and of course our passion about Atlanta United. But more importantly, really how all that really shapes him, and it's in everything we do. So I'm excited to hear about what's next for him.
Yeah, me too.
We couldn't get the big announcement here, whatever that could be, but hopefully we will soon. But it's good. Well, thanks everybody for joining us here on the Jeff and Alex podcast. If you are on YouTube, make sure you subscribe. If you're on a podcast platform, make sure you also subscribe and download and share as much as you want. Jeff, it's good to see you.
You too, Alex.
And we'll be back next week on the Jeff and Alex podcast.